overthrow an authoritarian leader, and you're going to have a relatively democratic society, then protecting a minority becomes a problem.
Other people remained loyal because they did not want change or because they believed that independence would not improve their lives. Some thought the actions of the British government were not bad enough to bring about a rebellion. Others did not believe that the rebels could win a war against a nation as powerful as Britain. American Indians disagreed among themselves about the revolution. Congress knew it had to make peace with the Indians as soon as the war started. If not, American troops might have to fight them and the British at the same time. To prevent trouble, American officials tried to stop settlers from moving into Indian lands. In some places, the Indians joined the Americans, but generally they supported the British. They expected the British to win. They saw the war as a chance to force the Americans to leave their lands. At times, the Indians fought on the side of the British, but left when the British seemed to be losing the battle. The Americans did not forget that the Indians chose to fight for the British. When the war was over, the Americans felt they owed the Indians nothing. African slaves in the colonies were also divided about which side to join during the American Revolution. Thousands of slaves fought for the British. The British offered them freedom if they served in the Army or Navy. Some American states also offered to free slaves who served, and hundreds of free blacks fought on the American side. Many slaves, however, felt their chances for freedom were better with the British. At least 5,000 blacks served with the colonial American forces. Most had no choice. They were slaves, and their owners took them to war or sent them instead of the owner's sons. Other slaves felt that a nation built on freedom might share some of that freedom with them. In the South, many slave owners kept their slaves at home rather than send them to fight. Later in the war, when every man was needed, many slaves drove wagons and carried supplies. Those who served in the colonial army and navy were not separated from whites. They fought side by side with whites during the American Revolution. But historians say most slaves spent the war as they always had, working on their owners' farms. The American rebels called themselves patriots. Those who supported the British were known as Tories. Patriots often seized the property of Tories to help pay for the war. They also kidnapped the slaves of Tories to use as laborers for the army. Many Tories were forced from towns in which they had lived all their lives. Some were tortured or hanged. In New Jersey, Tories and patriots fought one another with guns and sometimes burned each other's houses and farms. Some historians say the American Revolution was really the nation's first civil war. The revolution divided many families. Jane Gordon at the Massachusetts Historical Society tells of a woman named Phoebe. Phoebe was married to a patriot, but her brother was a Tory.
And we think about what it must have been like for Phoebe in the middle between her husband and her brother. So that's a perfect example of a family that was split.
The Patriots were also split among themselves in their thinking. The colonies did not really think of themselves as one nation. They saw themselves as independent states, trying to work together toward a common goal. Historian Gordon Wood says, at first, the United States was more like the European Union is today.
When Jefferson said my country, he meant Virginia. John Adams said my country meant Massachusetts.
This meant that Congress could not order the states to do anything they did not want to do. Congress could not demand that the states provide money for the war. It could only ask for their help. George Washington, a tough general, could not draft men into the army. He could only wait for the states to send them. Washington showed that he was a good politician by the way he kept Congress and the 13 states supporting him throughout the war. Just as Americans did not all agree about the war, the British people did not agree about it either. Many supported the government's decision to fight. They believed that the war was necessary to rescue loyalists from the Patriots. Others did not think Britain should fight the Americans because the Americans had not invaded or threatened their country. They believed that Britain should leave the colonies alone to do as they wished. King George was not able to do this, however. He supported the war as a way to continue his power in the world and to rescue British honor in the eyes of other national leaders. Whichever side British citizens were on, there was no question that the war was causing severe problems in Britain. British businessmen could no longer trade with the American colonies. Prices increased. Taxes did too. And young men were forced to serve in the Royal Navy. At the start of the war, the British believed that the rebellion was led by a few extremists in New England. They thought the other colonies would surrender if no area could be surrounded and controlled. So they planned to separate New England from the other colonies by taking control of the Hudson River Valley. The British changed their plans after they were defeated in the Battle of Saratoga in New York State. Historian Gordon Wood says the British loss changed the nature of the war.
The French feel at this point that the Americans might make it, and therefore they throw in their support. Once the French come on board, then the British are really panicked. At that point, they offer the Americans everything the Americans had wanted, save independence. But it was too late.
The British experienced many problems fighting the war. Their troops were far from home across a wide ocean. It was difficult to bring in more troops and supplies. Gordon Wood says the distance across the Atlantic was one reason the British lost the war.
Even though they were the most powerful nation in the world, had a superb army, and of course completely controlled the seas, and they were dealing with ragtag army of George Washington and a bunch of militia, and they couldn't do it.
General Washington's army had its own problems, too. Congress never had enough money. States often did not do what they were supposed to do. And citizens were not always willing to fight. Soldiers were poorly trained and would promise to serve for only a year or so.
And that's our program for today. Join us again tomorrow to keep learning English through stories from around the world. I'm Ashley Thompson.
And I'm Dan Novak.
This is VOA News. Reporting via remote, I'm Jeff Custer. Ukrainian officials say a Russian missile strike has hit just 300 meters from a nuclear power plant in the country's south. Ukraine's defense ministry called the attack an act of nuclear terrorism. Ukraine's atomic energy operator said the strike came just after midnight Monday and hit an industrial complex in the southern Mykolaiv region that includes the Phikwe nuclear power plant. The agency says the impact didn't affect the plant's reactors, but caused an explosion that broke more than 100 windows at buildings in the complex and forced a hydropower plant to shut down temporarily. Russia didn't immediately acknowledge the strike on the industrial complex, which sits along the southern Bug River. In an interview Sunday on the CBS News program 60 Minutes, U.S. President Joe Biden praised Ukrainians for their gritty fight against a huge Russian invasion force and said they're defeating Russia in individual battles. But the president said it's difficult to see if Ukraine is actually winning the war.
Is to get Russia out of Ukraine completely and to recognize its sovereignty. They're defeating Russia. Russia's turning out not to be as competent and capable as many people thought they were going to be, but winning the war and the damage it's doing and the citizens and the innocent people are being killed, it's hard to count that as win.
Biden said victory in Ukraine would be to get Ukraine would get Russia out of the country completely, or for them to and for Russia to recognize Ukraine's sovereignty completely. For more information on this story and other stories we're covering, please go to our website, voanews.com. This is VOA News. A state funeral has been held at Westminster Abbey for Britain's Queen Elizabeth II, a solemn ceremony filled with pageantry and steeped in tradition and ritual. Associated Press correspondent Charles Deladesma reports.
A king had led members of the royal family in a procession behind the coffin to Westminster Abbey, where royal leaders were among the congregation for an hour-long service. During the sermon, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, remembers Queen Elizabeth.
Now gone from us, she was joyful, present to so many, touching a multitude of lives.
The coffin left the Abbey to proceed by gun carriage to Wellington Arch, before the Queen's laid to rest later next to her beloved husband, Prince Philip, at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Charles Deladesma, London.
2 minutes of silence followed the funeral all across Britain. The last state funeral was held almost 60 years ago for Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister who led the nation to a World War II victory. Hurricane Fiona is bearing down on the Dominican Republic Monday after knocking out the power grid and unleashing floods and landslides in Puerto Rico, where the governor said the damage was catastrophic. No deaths have been reported, but authorities in the U.S. territory said it was too early to estimate the total damage from the storm that was still forecast to unleash torrential rain across Puerto Rico Monday. Up to more than 76 centimeters of rain was forecast for the island's eastern and southern regions. A national over. Union's executive branch has unveiled plans for new laws that it says will help protect media freedom and independence in the 27-nation bloc at a time of mounting concern about the dangers of political influence in several member countries. Spurred into action by allegations of state spying on reporters, the use of political pressure on news outlets, and the placing of advertising to peddle influence, the European Commission said Monday the EU needs a European Media Freedom Act. European Commission Vice President Vera Jourova told reporters, "We see a lot of worrying trends regarding media in Europe. It's not only a matter of one or two countries." She said the proposed legislation is needed for the times we live in, not for the times we would like to live in. Repeating the hour's top news story, Ukrainian officials say a Russian missile strike has hit just 300 meters from a nuclear power plant in the country's south. The U.S. Defense Ministry called the attack an act of nuclear terrorism. Reporting via remote, I'm Jeff Custer. This is VOA News.